My wife came into the kitchen one Saturday morning and said, "Frank, we're going to make the house smarter." I looked around. I said, "Good. Let me know when it happens." She didn't laugh. That's how I knew I was in trouble. She said, "I'm serious." I said, "So am I." She put her coffee down. "We need a smart home." I said, "Why?" "Because everything is becoming smart." I looked at the refrigerator. "It already knows what I want." She smiled. "What?" "I open it every 20 minutes, and it still doesn't have pie." She said, "I'm talking about technology." "I know." "We can control the lights with our phones." "I can control the lights with my hand." "We can control the thermostat from anywhere." "I can control the thermostat from the thermostat." "We can have a smart doorbell." "I already have a doorbell." "This one has a camera." "I have eyes." She stared at me. I said, "2 of them." She sighed. "Frank, we're living in the past." I said, "The past worked." She said, "That's not the point." It usually is. She had been watching videos online. Apparently, people now live in houses that talk to them. You can tell your house to turn the lights on. You can ask your house about the weather. You can tell your house to play music. You can even ask your house to order groceries. I said, "Why would I want my house ordering groceries?" My wife said, "Because it's convenient." I said, "That's how you end up with 17 avocados." She laughed. I said, "We don't need a smart home." She said, "We do." I knew that tone. After 42 years of marriage, you learn there are several different versions of we. There's the real we, there's the polite we, there's the dangerous we. And then there's, we need to talk. That one can cost you money. She showed me her phone. "Look." It was an advertisement, a beautiful modern house. Everything was white, everything was shiny. Nobody lived there. I said, "That's not a home." "What is it?" "A showroom." She laughed. "Look at the lights." The lights came on automatically. I said, "Very impressive." "See?" "Yeah." "You don't like it?" "I like lights." She smiled. "So you'll try it?" I should have known better. I said, "Fine." She smiled. That was the first mistake. The first thing she bought was a smart speaker. It was a little cylinder. I looked at it. I said, "What's that?" "Our assistant." I said, "We hired someone?" "No." "Then why is it sitting there?" She said, "It listens to us." I stopped. "It does what?" "It listens." "Why?" "So we can talk to it." I looked at the speaker, then at my wife, then back at the speaker. I said, "Does it pay rent?" She laughed. I didn't. She plugged it in. A little light came on. The machine said, "Hello." I jumped. My wife laughed. I said, "It just talked." "Yes." "It doesn't know me." "It knows you." "How?" "It's connected to your account." I looked at it. I said, "Good morning." It said, "I'm sorry, I didn't understand." I said, "That's okay." My wife said, "You have to say the wake word first." "What wake word?" She told me. I said it. The machine lit up. I said, "What's the weather?" It told me. I looked outside. It was sunny. I said, "I already knew that." My wife said, "Ask it something else." I thought about it. "What time is it?" It told me. I looked at my watch. Same answer. I said, "This thing is expensive." She said, "It can do much more." "Like what?" "Play music." I said, "I have a radio." "Turn the lights on." "I have a hand." "Set reminders." "I have a wife." She looked at me. I said, "That's not what I meant." She laughed. The next morning I walked into the kitchen. I said the wake word. Nothing. I said it again. Nothing. I said it louder. Nothing. My wife walked in. "What are you doing?" "Talking to your machine." "You're saying it wrong." "I've been saying the same word all morning." She said it once. The machine answered immediately. I looked at her. I said, "It's ignoring me." She laughed. "Maybe it doesn't understand your accent." I said, "It's an American house." She laughed. "Just speak clearly." I looked at the speaker. I said, "Good morning." Nothing. My wife said, "Try again." I said, "Good morning." Nothing. I leaned closer. "Good morning." Still nothing. I looked at my wife. I said, "I think it hates me." She said, "Frank, it's a machine." I said, "That's what it wants you to think." The next thing was the smart lights. My wife replaced the switches. Now we could control every light from our phones. She showed me. "See?" She tapped the screen. The living room lights came on. She tapped again. They went off. I said, "That's incredible." She smiled. "Right?" "Absolutely." Then I stood up. I walked to the switch. I turned it on. She said, "What are you doing?" "Turning on the light." "You could have used your phone." "I was already here." She laughed. I said, "That's the problem with technology." "What?" "It creates solutions for problems nobody had." She shook her head. But then she got excited. She said, "Watch this." She told the house, "Turn on the kitchen lights." The lights came on. She smiled. Then she said, "Turn off the kitchen lights." They went off. She looked at me. I said, "Okay." She smiled. "You like it?" "I like that the kitchen listens better than the children ever did." She laughed. Then she showed me the bedroom, the hallway, the porch, the garage. Every light could be controlled from her phone. I said, "Can it turn off the neighbor's lights?" "No." Shame. A week later, I discovered the downside. My wife was at the grocery store. I was sitting in the living room watching television. Suddenly, the lights went off. I waited. They came back on. Then off again. Then on. I yelled, "Carol!" No answer. I yelled again. Nothing. I walked into the kitchen. The lights turned on. I walked back into the living room. They turned off. I walked back into the kitchen. On. Living room. Off. Kitchen. On. Living room. Off. I stood in the hallway. Both lights were off. I said, "This is a game now?" My wife called, "What are you doing?" "I don't know." "Why are you walking around?" "The house is turning the lights off." She laughed. "I'm controlling them from my phone." "Why?" "I'm testing the system." "Well, the system thinks I'm a burglar." She laughed harder. "Just turn them back on." "I don't have the app." "You don't need it." "I don't have the app." "Frank, just ask the assistant." I looked at the speaker. I said, "Turn on the lights." Nothing. I said it again. Nothing. I shouted, "Turn on the lights!" Nothing. I called my wife. She said, "Frank, you have to say the wake word first." I said, "I know." Then I said it. Nothing. My wife said, "Are you saying it correctly?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Try again." I did. Nothing. Then the lights came on. I froze. My wife said, "See?" I said, "I didn't say anything." She said, "Maybe it heard you." I looked at the speaker. I said, "That's what worries me." Then came the smart doorbell. This one had a camera. My wife was thrilled. "Now we'll know who's at the door." I said, "We already know." "How?" "Because we have windows." She installed it anyway. The first day it worked perfectly. Someone walked up, my wife's phone buzzed. She looked at it. "Someone's at the door." I said, "I know." "How?" "I heard the doorbell." She looked at me. I said, "Still works." Then the camera started sending notifications. "Motion detected, motion detected, motion detected." I looked at my phone. "What does that mean?" My wife said, "Someone is near the house." I said, "Who?" "I don't know." "Then why did it tell us?" "Because it detected movement." I said, "That's not news." The next notification said, "Motion detected." I looked outside. It was a squirrel. I said, "Your smart doorbell just called the police on a squirrel." She laughed. Then, "Motion detected." A bird. Then, "Motion detected." A leaf. Then, "Motion detected." I said, "This thing has anxiety." My wife laughed. Then one night at 11:30, my phone buzzed. I woke up. I looked at it. Motion detected. I jumped out of bed. "Carol!" "What?" "Someone's outside." She sat up. "What?" "The doorbell." She looked at her phone. She tapped the camera. We watched. A man was standing near our porch. I said, "Who is that?" My wife zoomed in. It was our neighbor. He was holding a garbage bag. I said, "What is he doing?" She said, "Taking out the trash." "At 11:30? She shrugged. I said, "That's suspicious." She laughed. Then the neighbor looked directly at the camera. He waved. I waved back. My wife said, "You can't see him." "I know." "Then why did you wave?" "Habit." The next morning I saw him. He said, "Frank, did you get an alert last night?" I said, "Yes." He laughed. "I was taking out the trash." "I know." "How?" "Your doorbell told me." He shook his head. I said, "This neighborhood is becoming too efficient." Then my wife replaced the thermostat. She said, "This one learns." I said, "Good." "What?" "It can learn how to turn itself off." She laughed. "No, Frank. It learns our schedule." I said, "Our schedule?" "Yes." "It doesn't know our schedule." "It will." "How?" "It watches when we change the temperature." I looked at the thermostat. "It's watching us?" She smiled. "Not like that." "That's exactly like that." She said, "It's smart." I said, "So is our dog." "We don't have a dog." "Exactly." She laughed. The thermostat worked well for about 3 days. Then it started making decisions. One morning I woke up sweating. I walked downstairs. The house was 76 degrees. I said, "Why is it so hot?" My wife said, "The thermostat thinks we like it warm in the morning." I said, "It doesn't know me." She said, "It knows our routine." I said, "My routine is to be comfortable." She laughed. I changed the temperature. 10 minutes later, it changed itself. I stared at the thermostat. I changed it again. It changed again. I said, "Okay." My wife came into the room. "What?" "Your thermostat is fighting me." She looked. "Oh." I said, "It moved." She said, "It's adjusting." I said, "It's losing." She laughed. I changed it again. It changed again. I stood there. My wife said, "Frank, stop fighting the thermostat." "I am not fighting it." "What are you doing?" "Negotiating." She laughed. I said, "Listen." I stood in front of it. "You're a thermostat." Nothing. "You have one job." Nothing. "Make the room comfortable." Nothing. I pointed at it. "If I have to wear shorts in January, we're going to have a problem." My wife walked away laughing. That evening she said, "You're ridiculous." I said, "I just want control over my own temperature." She said, "You sound like a dictator." I said, "It's 72 degrees, not a political system." Then she bought a robot vacuum. This was where I drew the line. It looked like a little black pancake. I said, "What is that?" "A robot vacuum." "It looks like a hat." She laughed. "It cleans the floors." "I clean the floors." "No, I clean the floors." I said, "Exactly." She said, "You don't have to anymore." I looked at the robot. I said, "So now this thing has my job?" She laughed. She turned it on. It started moving. Slowly. It went under the couch, came out, turned around, went toward the kitchen, stopped, turned. I watched it. My wife said, "Isn't it amazing?" I said, "It doesn't know where it's going." "It maps the house." I looked at it. "Does it have a map?" "Yes." "Does it know the way out?" She laughed. The robot vacuum became part of the family. My wife gave it a name. I refused. She called it Rosie. I called it the pancake. She said, "Frank, you need to respect technology." I said, "Technology needs to respect me." One afternoon, Rosie disappeared. My wife panicked. "Where is it?" I said, "I don't know." "Did you move it?" "No." "Frank." I didn't touch it. We searched the house. Nothing. We looked under the furniture. Nothing. We checked the app. The app said, "Robot is cleaning." I said, "It's not here." My wife said, "It has to be somewhere." We followed the map. The little dot moved. It was in the garage. We went into the garage. Nothing. The dot moved. I said, "It's running away." We followed it. The dot moved again, behind the car. I looked under the car. There it was, stuck against a box. I said, "This is the smartest thing in the house?" My wife picked it up. She said, "It got stuck." I said, "So do I." She laughed. Then she put it down. It started moving again. It came toward me, stopped at my feet. I looked down. It looked up at me. I said, "Don't start." My wife laughed. The robot turned around. I said, "See?" "What?" "It knows." The television was next. My wife said, "We should connect everything." I said, "Everything works already." "No, it doesn't." The television turns on. "But now we can stream everything." "We already have television." "We can watch anything." I said, "That's the problem." She connected the television. Suddenly, we had hundreds of channels. Movies, shows, documentaries, sports, news, old shows, new shows, cooking, travel, nature, history. I stared at the screen. I said, "There are too many." My wife said, "That's the point." "No." "What?" "We used to have 3 channels. And? If there was nothing good on, we went to bed." She laughed. "Now we have everything." "Exactly." She handed me the remote. I pressed a button. The screen asked, "Who's watching?" I said, "Frank." It said, "What do you want to watch?" I said, "Television." My wife laughed. I said, "Why does television need to ask me what I want to watch?" "Because it recommends things." "It doesn't know me." "It knows what you've watched." I looked at the screen. "What have I watched?" She said, You watched 6 documentaries about World War II. They were interesting. Then you watched 4 hours of videos about lawn mowers. They were informative. Then you watched a man repair a clock. It was broken, she laughed. I said, the television knows too much. Then the recommendations appeared. Because you watched lawnmower videos, it showed me top 10 leaf blowers. I said, see? My wife laughed. Then it recommended how to fix your marriage. I stared at the screen. My wife stared at me. I said, I didn't watch that. She said, I know. Then why is it recommending it? She laughed. I said, this house is turning against me. The big test came on a Sunday. My wife went shopping. I stayed home. She said, everything is connected now. I said, that's what worries me. She laughed. She left. I made coffee. The coffee machine worked. I sat down. The television worked. The lights worked. The thermostat worked. The doorbell worked. The robot vacuum was somewhere. Everything was fine. Then the internet went down. The television stopped. The lights stopped responding. The smart speaker stopped. The thermostat stopped. The doorbell app stopped. I sat there. The house was silent. I looked around. I said, finally. I got up. I turned on the lamp. It worked. I walked to the thermostat. It had a normal display. I adjusted it. It worked. I opened the curtains. Sunlight came in. I smiled. I made another coffee. I sat in my chair. I turned on the radio. It worked. I looked around. I said, look at that. The house wasn't broken. It was just normal. Then my wife came home. She walked in. Frank! What? The internet is down. I know. Everything is offline. I know. How are we going to control everything? I pointed around. With our hands. She stared at me. I said, remember those? She laughed. I said, turn the light on. She flipped the switch. It worked. She laughed. Okay. Turn it off. She did. I said, see? She smiled. Then the robot vacuum rolled into the room. We both looked at it. It stopped. I said, don't worry. We'll figure it out. The robot turned around. I said, see? My wife laughed. Maybe you were right. I looked at her. Don't say that too loudly. Why? The house might hear you. That evening, our daughter came over with the grandchildren. The kids loved the house. The oldest said, Grandpa, your house is smart. I said, that's what they tell me. He said, can I ask it something? I said, sure. He said the wake word. The speaker responded. He asked, what is the capital of France? It answered. The kids laughed. I said, see? My grandson asked, what is the biggest dinosaur? It answered. They laughed. Then my granddaughter asked, what's Grandpa's favorite food? The speaker didn't know. I said, finally, something useful. My wife said, pizza. I said, pie. My daughter said, those are not the same thing. I said, depends on the pie. Everyone laughed. Then my grandson said, can it tell jokes? I said, yes. He asked it. The speaker told the joke. Everyone laughed. I said, that's not funny. My daughter said, why? Because it doesn't have to live with you. My wife laughed. Then my grandson asked, can it make Grandpa happy? The speaker didn't understand. I said, see? My wife smiled. Then my grandson ran toward the robot vacuum. Can I ride it? I shouted, no. He stopped. Why? Because that's not a scooter. My daughter laughed. He said, But it moves. So does the lawnmower. Can I ride that? No. Why? Because I said so. He looked at the smart speaker. Can you tell Grandpa to let me ride the vacuum? The speaker answered, I'm sorry, I didn't understand. I said, Good. My wife laughed. A few weeks later, I got used to the smart house. Not because I became smarter, because the house became easier to ignore. I learned the lights, I learned the thermostat, I learned the television. I even learned the smart speaker, mostly. Sometimes I still ask it questions it doesn't understand. That's intentional. I don't want it getting too confident. One night, my wife and I were sitting in the living room. The lights were dim. The temperature was perfect. Music was playing. The robot vacuum was quietly cleaning. The television was off. My wife looked around. She said, See? See what? You like the smart home. I thought about it. I said, I do. She smiled. I said, but I learned something. What? A smart home is still a house. She nodded. And a smart house doesn't make smart people. She laughed. Very funny. I wasn't joking. She laughed again. I said, the lights can turn themselves on. Yep. The thermostat can learn our habits. Yep. The television knows what I watch. Yep. The doorbell knows when someone walks up. Yep. The vacuum knows where the dirt is. She smiled. And? I looked at her. None of them knows where I put my glasses. She laughed. I said, that's the one thing I need technology to solve. She said, your glasses are on your head. I touched my head. There they were. I looked at her. I said, I knew that. She laughed. Then the smart speaker suddenly lit up. It said, I'm sorry, I didn't understand. I looked at my wife. I said, see? She laughed. What? Even the machine doesn't understand me. She leaned against me. You know what? What? I think that's why I like you. I smiled. Because I'm confusing? Because you're old-fashioned. I said, careful. She laughed. I looked around the room. The lights were soft. The house was quiet. Everything was working. And for once, I wasn't complaining. Then the robot vacuum bumped into my shoe. I looked down. It backed up, moved forward, bumped me again. I said, okay. My wife laughed. I pointed at it. You and me are going to have a conversation. She said, Frank, it's a vacuum. I know. It can't understand you. I looked at the robot. I said, that's what you think. Part 11. The Final Test. The next morning, my wife came into the kitchen. She said, Frank, I have an idea. I put my coffee down. No. You don't even know what it is. I know how this works. She laughed. We should get a smart refrigerator. I stared at her. No. It can tell us when we're out of milk. I can tell. How? I opened the refrigerator. It can make a grocery list. I can make a list. It has a camera inside. I stopped. A camera? Yes. Inside the refrigerator? Yes. I looked at our refrigerator. I said, absolutely not. She laughed. Why? Because there are things in there I don't want anybody seeing. She smiled. Like what? I said, yesterday's pie. You ate yesterday's pie? I know. Then what's the problem? The refrigerator doesn't need to know. She laughed. I said, there's a line. What line? You can have smart lights. Okay. A smart thermostat. Okay. A smart doorbell. Okay. A robot vacuum. Okay. But I draw the line at a refrigerator that watches me eat. She laughed. Then she said, "Fine." I smiled. Good. She walked away. I took a sip of coffee. Then she called from the other room. "Frank?" "What?" "What if it has a sale?" I closed my eyes. "I'm going back to bed." She laughed. After a few months, our house had become very smart. The lights knew when we entered a room. The thermostat knew when we were home. The doorbell knew when someone came to the door. The television knew what we watched. The vacuum knew where the dirt was. The speaker knew when it didn't understand me. Everything was connected. Except me. I still preferred a light switch. I still used a watch. I still opened the curtains. I still walked to the thermostat. And I still shouted at the robot vacuum when it got stuck. But one evening, my wife and I were sitting outside. She said, "You know what?" "What?" "I think you finally like the smart home." I smiled. "I do." She looked surprised. "Really?" "Yeah." "Why?" I looked at the house, then at her. "Because it gives us more time." She smiled. I said, "We don't have to get up to turn the lights off." She laughed. "We don't have to worry about the temperature." She nodded. "We know who's at the door." "Yep." "And the vacuum cleans the floor." She smiled. I said, "So maybe it's not about replacing the old way. What is it about?" "Making life a little easier." She nodded. I took her hand. "Just don't make the house smarter than me." She laughed. "I don't think that's possible." I looked at her. "That's not funny." She kissed me. It was a little funny. I smiled. Then the speaker inside the house suddenly said, "I'm sorry, I didn't understand." I looked at my wife. She looked at me. We both started laughing. I said, "See?" "What?" "Even the house knows you're right." The next morning I walked into the kitchen. I said the wake word, nothing. I said it again, nothing. I tried again, still nothing. I looked at the speaker. I said, "Are you ignoring me?" Nothing. My wife walked in. She said the wake word once. The speaker answered immediately. I looked at her. She smiled. I said, "I'm done." "With what?" "The smart home." She laughed. I pointed at the speaker. "It listens to you." She said, "Maybe you're saying it wrong." I said, "I've been saying the same word for 3 months." She laughed. I walked over to the speaker. I picked it up. My wife said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm taking it outside." "Why?" "I'm going to have a talk with it." She laughed. I carried it toward the garage. The robot vacuum came around the corner. I stopped. It stopped. We stared at each other. I said, "Don't you start." It turned around. I looked at my wife. She was laughing. I said, "You see this?" "What?" "They're communicating." She laughed harder. I carried the speaker into the garage. I put it on the workbench. I looked at it. I said, "Listen." Nothing. "I don't know what your problem is." Nothing. "But this is my house." Nothing. "I've lived here longer than you've existed." Nothing. "I paid the mortgage." Nothing. "I fixed the roof." Nothing. "I changed the light bulbs." Nothing. "I even cleaned the garage." The speaker suddenly lit up. It said, "I'm sorry, I didn't understand." I looked at it. I smiled. I said, "Exactly." Then I walked back into the house. My wife was standing in the doorway. She said, "Did you solve it?" I said, "No." "What are you going to do?" I looked at the light switch. I flipped it. The light came on. I smiled. Sometimes, I said, the old technology still works. My wife laughed. And that's what I've learned at 70. You don't have to understand every new thing. You don't have to own every gadget. You don't have to make your house smarter. Sometimes you just need a comfortable chair, a good cup of coffee, somebody you love sitting beside you, and a light switch that works. Because after all these years, I finally figured out what a truly smart home is. It's not the one that talks to you. It's not the one that learns your habits. It's not the one that knows when you're coming home. It's the one where, after 42 years of marriage, your wife still walks into the room, looks at you, and somehow knows exactly what you're about to say. And that's when you realize, maybe she's the smart one. I just hope she doesn't tell the refrigerator.